Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Faricy, and I have the honor and privilege to be the director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute and the Hicker Family Professor in Renewing Democratic Community. This event is part of the Campbell State of Democracy Lecture Series. I'd like to start by first thanking the wonderful Campbell staff, Jackie Nacheski and Kelly Coleman. Thank you for all your tireless work in making events like these possible. And of course, I'd like to extend my thanks to the Dean's Office for their continued support. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, the firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. Now, while the nation has been fixated on executive orders and government dysfunction, Congress and the White House quietly reshaped America's social contract. During the tumultuous first 9 months of the second Trump administration, the media has obsessively tracked an unprecedented flood of executive orders, from establishing DOGE to prosecuting flag burning, from issuing gold cards to restoring the Department of War. There has been a flurry of executive orders coming from the White House. Meanwhile, on the other side, the 119th Congress has distinguished itself as one of the least productive in American history, and the House currently sits dark during a record-breaking federal government shutdown. Yet, if we go back 5 months, there is a brief period where the White House and Congress came together and passed what is known as the Big Beautiful Bill. On July 4th, 2025, President Trump signed this act into law. This single piece of legislation fundamentally altered the trajectory of American fiscal, social, and defense policy for the next decade. And we are here today to talk about this bill and its policy implications. And this law doesn't just tinker at the margins. It represents a dramatic restructuring of the American social safety net, combined with the largest peacetime defense buildup in modern history. It also makes permanent trillions in tax cuts while simultaneously enacting some of the deepest cuts ever to Medicaid and food assistance programs. It raises the debt ceiling by $5 trillion while slashing spending on the most vulnerable populations in the country. It commits $150 billion to military modernization on items such as AI-driven weapon systems, missile defense, advanced shipbuilding, while expanding ICE's budget tenfold from $10 billion to over $100 billion by 2029. This is not incremental policy. This is a wholesale reordering of national priorities, one that will determine who prospers and who struggles, how we defend ourselves, and what role government plays in American life. Our three panelists today, experts in tax policy, defense strategy, and social welfare, will help us understand not just what this bill does, but what it means for the country we're becoming. Let's meet our panelists. First, Colleen Heflin is a professor of public administration and international affairs. As a research and policy scholar for nearly 20 years, Heflin is regarded as a national expert on food insecurity, nutrition and welfare policy, and the well-being of vulnerable populations. Heflin has published over 70 research articles, and her work has appeared in leading journals such as the American Sociological Review, Social Problems, Health Affairs, and Medical Care. Her research has been funded by the National Institutes for Health, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Russell Sage Foundation. Heflin has experience engaging with federal policymakers, recently providing expert testimony before Congress, providing technical assistance to states working to improve access to food and nutritional assistance programs, and working with county agencies to redesign their SNAP application process. Colleen Heflin received her PhD from the University of Michigan. Next, Brent Parmenter is the Fansteel Chair in Leadership and Professor of Practice of Public Administration and International Affairs. Prior to joining Syracuse University, he served as the inaugural Chief Talent Management Officer for the U.S. Department of Defense. He is also head of the Non-Traditional Talent, Military and Veteran Affairs and STEM Workforce programs at Walmart. A U.S. Army combat veteran, Parmenter served nearly 25 years as an infantry officer, including 40 months of combat service in Iraq. In 2017, he was appointed the first civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army for California's Silicon Valley, and later served in the same role for Arkansas. Parmenter holds a Bachelor of Science from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, master's degrees from LSU and the U.S. Army War College, and is a graduate in the certificate program in entrepreneurship and innovation from Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. Next, we have Len Burman, who is Professor Emeritus of Public Administration and International Affairs and a fellow at the Urban Institute. He co-founded the Tax Policy Center, a joint project of the Urban Institute and the Brookings Institution in 2002. Burman was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysts at the Department of Treasury from 1998 to 2000, and Senior Analyst at the Congressional Budget Office from 1988 to 1997. Additionally, he is past president of the National Tax Association, and in 2019, Len was inducted as a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. Burman is co-author of Taxes in America, What Everyone Needs to Know, and author of The Labyrinth of Capital Gains Tax Policy, a guide for the perplexed. Len received a PhD in economics from the University of Minnesota. All right, our format today will be that first we will hear from each of our panelists opening thoughts on what they believe to be significant takeaways from the OBBB. Then after hearing from each of our three panelists, I'm then going to open up a panel discussion among the four of us for around 20 to 30 minutes. And then in the final section of our panel today, we will open it up to you, the audience, to ask questions. In this online format, if you can please put your questions in the Q&A box as you think of them during the course of the panel. And then in that last section, I will go ahead and read questions from the question and answer box to our panelists. So let's go ahead and begin. And we are going to start off hearing from Brent Parmenter. Brent, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chris. And thanks to everyone for being here. When we talked about this as a small group, each of us has a different perspective on this. And what I had hoped to do was maybe focus my remarks on something that may receive a little less attention than tax rates or program changes, but how a bill like this actually lands operationally across institutions and labor markets and communities, primarily because in public administration, the distance between legislation and lived experience is almost entirely implementation. And so I have 7 implementation implications I'd like to just highlight briefly up front, and then 3 takeaways, and then hopefully that will generate some thoughts when combined with both Colleen and Len, some good questions and answer period time afterwards. So the first is that a bundled bill signals a bundled problem. The One Big Beautiful Bill isn't just a tax bill, it's this bundled amalgamation of tax permanence and border security and immigration enforcement and Medicaid and safety net restructuring, things like climate incentive rollbacks and debt ceiling adjustments. And when Congress bundles when governing, it bundles when governing coalitions are weak. And operationally, bundling creates cross pressure in agencies that have to deliver conflicting mandates simultaneously. This is the first important implication for the audience, in that policy coherence on paper doesn't really equal implementability on the ground. The second implication is the street level bureaucracy. I know everybody in the MPA programs have heard that term, but street level bureaucracy is the real battleground. And when Medicaid paperwork requirements tighten, or when detention capacity expands, or the impact shows up not in the Capitol, but in county social service offices and emergency rooms and public defender calendars and foster care systems. And when you scale up border enforcement, you scale up processing, not just apprehension. And communities absorb these loads, and street level discretion is where statutes become the reality. And we're already seeing these stressors with backlogs and procedural disenrollment and increased uncompensated care and county funding requests. The third implication comes down to institutional role, the blurring of institutional roles, and that's one of the less appreciated effects of the bill. I think expanding defense-backed enforcement at the border puts the military's professional identity towards domestic security, and historically that's where democracies become vulnerable. A fourth implication is the labor market consequence. This is near and dear to my last role in the Department of Defense as an assistant secretary in the people space, where the bill accelerates demand across labor markets in aerospace manufacturing and surveillance systems and detention services and energy extraction, but it cuts talent pipelines in Medicaid finance nursing, community health roles, renewable energy installation, and many other areas. And we end up with this mismatched labor demand, and it's a classic implementation externality, and the public rarely links workforce shortages to federal statute. As a fifth implementation consequence, fiscal federalism gets much more complicated when you have this kind of activity in Congress, because when funding streams shift, states have to modify eligibility systems and retool benefit determinations. The supplemental energy incentive, they have to supplement energy incentives locally. Some states will be able to respond, others won't, and it magnifies the geographic inequality, not because it intends to, but because state capacity is different. As the next area to consider, administrative capacity is really a rate limiter, in line with the previous comment, where this bill assumes that agencies can scale detention capacity or accelerate case adjudication or increase deportation throughput, but Congress doesn't appropriate the staffing required to administer all of that at speed, and the bottleneck really isn't the law necessarily, it's human capital. And then the last implication of the 7 to discuss is that implementation really becomes political in some ways, where even though the panel here is focused on policy and policy consequences, backlogs become headlines and state lawsuits become news cycles and deportation volumes become campaign ads. And so implementation in many ways creates the politics of it. So 3 main takeaways, I think, for our democracy. The first that I would throw out there is administrative capacity is democratic capacity. If the agencies fail, the citizens lose trust in the system. The omnibus strategy trades institutional clarity for political passage. So short-term legislative wins become long-term operational burdens once it gets into the implementation phase. And then geography becomes destiny. And depending on where you sit, you experience either relief, erosion, opportunity, or displacement at times. And I guess as a closing thought, before handing it over to my colleagues, I think we often treat legislation like a finish line, but in public administration, it's the starting gun. And the real question for a democratic public isn't just what did Congress intend, it's what can the system actually deliver sustainably and fairly over time. And thank you for the opportunity to start us off, Chris, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Brent. I appreciate that. That was a great overview about the implementation challenges that correspond with passing a sizable bill such as the OBBB. Next, we're going to turn to Len Burman, who will talk about not only some of the tax implications, but how this is paired with some of the social spending cuts. Len, the floor is yours. Oh, I'm sorry, Len, you're muted.
That's good, because I didn't like what I just said. I'm going to talk about the problems that OB3A solved and the problems that OB3A made worse. So what problems did OB3A solve? One is, without action, rich people would face a big tax increase. They solved that one. They knocked it out of the park. They extended the tax rate cuts for that were part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, in 2018. And they extended a number of business provisions that would benefit corporations and unincorporated businesses. They did a bunch of other extenders, and they added other things as well that I'll talk about in a moment. The president made a bunch of campaign proposals, which some of us were wondering as to how they would be implemented in law. Well, basically all of the president's novel income tax ideas to cut taxes on tips, overtime, interest on loans for American cars, were implemented in a form as new deductions in the code. He also promised to exempt Social Security from tax. He didn't quite do that, but he created a new additional standard deduction for people who are 65 and over. So my comments are a little bit snarky. I feel like maybe I should edit them, but I won't. Rich people's kids don't benefit enough from intergenerational wealth. He addressed that problem with the new Trump accounts, which is a $1,000 contribution to a new savings account for kids between 2025 and 2028. And then the ability to make annual deductible contributions to these accounts every year until the child turns 18. One thing to keep in mind when you're looking at tax proposals is the fact that tax deductions are most valuable to higher income people. About 20 or 30% of households don't have any income tax liability at all. And they don't benefit at all from an income tax deduction. And the benefit depends on what your marginal tax rate is. So if you're in a 26%, 28% tax bracket, you get more than a quarter of the benefit of the contribution to these accounts back in terms of tax savings. Whereas if you're in a 10% bracket, which a lot of low middle income people are in, you get 10% back. There's still some Republican legislators in high tax states like New York and California. So they addressed that problem by quadrupling the allowable deduction for state and local taxes. To be fair, this is a proposal that probably has more support among Democrats who tend to come from high tax blue states and Republicans. But there were a bunch of people in the Republican coalition who wanted this as well. So what are the problems that OBBBA made worse? One that I've spent some time focusing on back since I was at Syracuse and before is that the national debt is exploding. Right now, it's verging on the highest level since the end of World War II. We borrowed a huge amount to finance that, and the trajectory is for it to just go up and up and up over time. This could create big problems for our kids and our grandkids. The OB3A would add about $4 trillion or more to the national debt over the next 10 years. It depends on whether some temporary provisions in it are made permanent or not. The Committee for Responsible Federal Budget estimates that if all the temporary provisions were made permanent, it would add more to the debt than the 2022 CHIPS Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law of 2021, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, which was aimed at dealing with COVID, and the CARES Act of 2020 combined. We don't invest enough in children. 10 million kids in the United States live in poverty. And we're the richest country in the world, the richest country in the history of the world. There's ample evidence that investing in children is about the most productive investment that the government can make. It pays returns over time because kids that don't grow up poor are more likely to complete their education, are less likely to end up being incarcerated. They're less likely to have other kinds of problems. They end up paying more taxes than they would have if they hadn't grown up in poverty, or if they end up paying more taxes than if they grew up in poverty. We know how to fix this. The American Rescue Plan Act increased the child tax credit from $2,000 to $3,000, or $3,600 for very young children. They made it fully refundable, which means you get the benefit of the tax credit even if you don't have any tax liability. Right now, you have to have earnings or a significant amount of tax liability to get the full benefit of the child tax credit. The American Rescue Plan Act cut the child poverty rate in half for a year. I honestly thought, and I testified before Congress, that I expected there'd be a bipartisan compromise that would restore some version of the ARPA child tax credit in exchange for extending the lower rates in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and business tax breaks. But the OB3A passed along party lines, and it does virtually nothing for low-income households. There are a bunch of tax cuts, and some of them benefit middle-income households, but because low-income people don't have much or any tax liability, they get little or no benefit from those. The thing that the OB3A did for the child tax credit was it increased the maximum credit from $2,000 to $2,200. And that helps middle and upper middle income families, but it doesn't do anything for poor families. There's a corollary that more of society's resources go to old people, baby boomers like me, and the $6,000 senior deduction that was added to respond to President Trump's promise to exempt Social Security benefits upper middle income seniors and doesn't do anything for poor seniors. One big problem, and one that is likely to get worse, is that economic inequality is extreme in the United States, and it's likely to get worse over time. The rise in artificial intelligence and other technologies means that the people who own these technologies are going to get richer and richer. And meanwhile, those technologies will be used to find substitutes for relatively unproductive labor and possibly, or eventually, for more productive labor as well as AI gets better. We basically have to find a way to deal with inequality before people are rioting in the streets because they can't feed themselves. The bill doesn't do anything to address that. Climate change, I guess it's no surprise given the president's views about what our energy sources should be, but the bill repealed some targeted environmental tax breaks that actually wouldn't be a bad thing if they were replaced with better designed climate tax incentives. The targeted tax subsidies for solar power, for wind power, for electric cars and things like that they're things that are popular with voters, but they mean government's basically picking technologies to deal with climate change and providing subsidies to them. A much better alternative would be to have something like a carbon tax, which admittedly is not politically very popular, but what it would do is it would give people an incentive to adopt new technologies or other measures like just driving less, walking more, to reduce use of carbon-based energy, but those weren't adopted. And the tax code is too complicated. And the Tax Foundation actually has a really nice piece on how OBBBA made the tax code even more complex. And if you look at some of these provisions, they're kind of mind-numbing. But aside from that, it's a really beautiful bill.
All right. Thank you, Len. There's a lot there for us to chew on, and I'm going to follow up with some of the items that you mentioned in the panel Q&A. Now we're going to turn the floor over to Colleen Heflin, who's going to share her screen and some slides with us. Colleen, take it away.
Thank you, Chris. And it's great to be on a panel with Brent and Lynn. I think I'm going to be continuing these themes of inequality, administrative capacity, and geographic differences. So I'm going to focus on how the One Big Beautiful Bill changed two programs in particular, SNAP, which I know really well, and Medicaid, which I know because it has a connection with SNAP. And so overall, I think it's important to keep in mind that according to CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, a nonpartisan Research Center indicates that 11 to 12 million people are going to lose health insurance coverage by 2034 through the Medicaid provisions. An average of 4.7 million fewer people will be enrolled in SNAP. And altogether, 1.2 million jobs are going to be lost. And there's going to be a transfer of costs, basically, from the federal government to the state government. That's going to result in $154 billion reduction in state GDPs by 2029. So let me go through and explain how this is going to happen exactly. So already starting this month, there have been expanded work requirements that have been put into place. The guidance came out October 10th during the shutdown, took states by surprise, and it was to be implemented this month already. And what those work requirements do is a work requirement requires 80 hours a month of some sort of community activity. And that's required to get past the time limit, which is 3 months of SNAP within a 36-month period. So the groups that are now bound by this new work requirement are able-bodied adults without dependent children. Those before were required to meet the work requirement if they were between the ages of 18 to 54. This has now been expanded to include the 55 to 64 age group. And this is really a big deal for those in the 60 to 64 age group. They've never before been required to have to meet the work requirement. Those that are 60 and above have special guidelines for SNAP. So this is really quite a significant change. Other groups such as veterans, homeless individuals, and young adults under age 25 who transitioned out of foster care are now newly required to meet the time limit and the work requirements. Parents of school-aged children used to be, they were exempted from the work requirement until the children reached age 18. Now those with children 14 or older are bound by the work requirements. And overall, CBO has estimated that this is going to remove 2 million from the SNAP caseload alone. Another significant change is that the law is changing how the Thrifty Food Plan changes are going to go into effect. So the OBBB now says that all future updates that identify the SNAP benefit amounts have to be cost neutral, which means USDA can't change the benefit level outside of inflation, even if food costs increase more than average inflation. CBO has estimated that this is going to create $37 billion in SNAP savings from 2027, which was the next year that the food plan was set to be, the costs were set to be re-examined from the 27 to 34 period. Another significant change is that the state share of administering SNAP has traditionally been 50% of the cost, and that goes up to 75% starting October 26. Additionally, the federal government has always covered the full amount of SNAP benefits, but starting in fiscal year 2028, states with SNAP error payment rates above 6% are going to have to pay a share of the SNAP benefits themselves. And it's important to know that only 8 states had error rates below 6% in fiscal year 2024, meaning most states are going to be required to contribute to the benefit levels. So again, we see that shifting from the federal government back down to the state government. Sorry, I'm going too fast. When we turn to Medicaid, we also see that there are work requirements and also restrictions on eligibility as well. So work requirements starting January 1st, 2027 will go into effect. So adults age 19 to 64 must complete at least 80 hours per month of community engagement activities to remain eligible for Medicaid. There are exemptions for veterans with total disability ratings, individuals with special medical needs or disabling conditions, and parents or guardians, caretakers of children under 14 or disabled individuals. So there are some exemptions here. The guidance on how those are going to be worked out has not been released yet. And also an important piece here is that there's going to be increased verification. So states are going to be required to verify individuals' monthly work status at least every 6 months. And individuals applying for coverage are going to need to have met the work requirement for 1 or more consecutive months before they apply. So this is going to be very limiting and costly. We know a lot about how work requirements work in this country for SNAP and for Medicaid. And what we know is they do not increase work participation, but they do reduce the number of people who participate in programs that require work, that have work requirements. So in 2018 in Arkansas, 1 in 4 people subject to the work requirement lost Medicaid coverage within 7 months of implementing them. In New Hampshire, 2 out of 3 lost Medicaid coverage within 2 months in 2019. And more recently, Georgia implemented some work requirements and found that the cost per enrollee was so high, $13,360. Again, getting back to the point that Brent said about these administrative costs of implementing these issues, but only 1/3 of the cost per enrollee was actually being spent on healthcare. So 2/3 was being spent with a large portion of this on trying to figure out and certify people through these work requirements. Similar results have been found for SNAP. And for SNAP, we know that the group that is least likely to be able to meet those work requirements are those with health issues that don't qualify for disabilities, and the poorest of the poor. And I think we're going to absolutely see those older adults in that 60 to 64 age range really find this problematic. So I'll end there. We know the One Big Beautiful Bill is going to have significant impact on how these 2 programs work at the state level in particular.
Hey, Colleen, thank you so much. So now I'm going to invite all the panelists into kind of a group-wide discussion. So feel free to unmute yourselves. And I'm actually going to follow up with Colleen's presentation. So can you tell us about why you think the work requirements are not effective in getting people into the labor force?
Sure. So in this country, the American ethic is people want to work. So there seems to be this common mental model of, it's always some guy sitting in a basement playing video games seems to be the dominant way to think about this.
That's been invoked by the Speaker of the House multiple times.
Yeah, so I don't, what I know from looking at the data is most people who are on these programs are either elderly, disabled, have young children, or are working already. And so those that can work do work. And so having a work requirement really adds an administrative burden, which is often very costly to figure out how to meet, and both for the state as well as for the individual. And it doesn't really usually come with much substantive help in finding work. It doesn't come with retraining. Things that probably Brent could talk a lot about, how you are looking for talent and how you manage talent, right? The work requirement itself doesn't change what you have to offer the labor market or create a better, stronger labor market in your area. It just says, for example, you can't get your cancer care covered because you're not able to work, which seems like a very odd incentive to put in place in the first place.
Thanks. Brent, what do you think about work incentives being tied to social benefits? Is it, are there other effective mechanisms to try to get people into the labor force, given your experience?
I do think there's other effective mechanisms. I'll start broad and then maybe come back to the immediate topic today. I think it's been proven we have experiments and pilot programs that show that whether you're a high school student looking at work in the future, whether you're a member of the workforce that's looking at upskilling or reskilling yourself or whatnot, it's very much a supply chain like activity when you look at it holistically and step back. The first is individuals have to have 3 or 4 elements to want to move forward in the workforce. One, you have to know what's available for you in the future in terms of an employment opportunity. You can either sustain what you're doing now, i.e. maintain the status quo, because that's your best option. But more often than not, people want to be mobile, as Colleen said. They want to work. They want to do something that advances them. And so you have to know what's out there in the future for you. You have to know what you need to do to move to that future state from whatever your current state is. And then you have to have some form of inspiration to want to take the journey. And then finally, you have to have a degree of self-efficacy or belief that you can and should take that journey. And that happens to all of us at different times. So I think that's the big piece. And I don't think this did anything to help any of those set of prerequisites in a material way. I think that it comes down to, and maybe I'll try to articulate this from a couple of different types of personas that are out there. If you're, let's say, a single mom of 2 in Ohio, you're looking at this and saying, despite billions of dollars spent, the felt security and affordability in your neighborhood really hasn't changed. Food insecurity and healthcare frictions have risen locally, and you're thinking that the winners in this are probably those that have some kind of political messaging, but the losers are working families that are juggling these rising costs. And it shows you that, people on the streets are going to evaluate policy in their grocery aisles, not the CBO tables. If you're a policeman or a construction worker somewhere, or a manufacturing individual, maybe there are some jobs in defense manufacturing that have risen on this, but education and healthcare supports have shrunk through this. And the upward mobility becomes more competitive and uneven because that while there may be some skilled trades opportunities in defense corridors, most households that are outside of the industrial belt are losers in this process. And it teaches you that generational opportunity really depends on where the capital flows. And then finally, if you're a Starbucks barista and you're this working class realist, you're looking at these things and saying, the SALT increase and estate exemptions and other things really don't do anything for renters. The complexity, it complicates the filings you have to do, and student debt, housing, and wages really have remained untouched. The winners in this, from that person's perspective, are wealthy homeowners who have advisors and the time to do this stuff, but losers are hourly workers who can't really navigate the complexity, and then that complexity becomes regressive.
Okay, thanks. So Len, I have a question for you where I'm going to start to bring in the intersection of politics and policy. And before I ask Len a question, I encourage people in the audience. I saw we have close to 100, great turnout. Please feel free if you have a question during this time to put it in the Q&A box, and we will come to those questions soon. So Len, I want to stick a little bit on the work requirements. So, in political science, we like to try to figure out why things occur in policy, right? So if it is understood that the work requirements don't actually incentivize people to join the labor force, I have 2 theories about why they were there that I want to throw at you, and you can choose A or B or both. So theory 1 is that this is a way of cutting people from these programs without having to be seen as cutting people from the programs, right? You know that it doesn't bring people to the labor force, but it does take people off the rolls, but you don't want to be seen as callous and heartless. So therefore, you frame this as, listen, we value hard work. It's part of the American ethos, bootstraps, Protestant work ethic, all of that. But really, it's a way to cut without seeming like you're cutting. So that's theory A. Theory B is this, that in America and really all over the democratized world, there's a history of wanting to ensure that hard-earned taxpayer dollars go to deserving beneficiaries and not undeserving beneficiaries. And the work requirements, it wasn't really a serious effort to get people in the labor force. It was a political signal. It was a political signal that we are going to reform this program to make sure that the people who are receiving these benefits are the deserving poor and not the undeserving poor, right? So that's theory B. So feel free to talk about A, B, or whether you think it might be a little bit of both.
I mean, I think it might be a little bit of both. And, I actually, with your help, I've seen a lot of the evidence on deservedness and how people respond to that. And clearly the programs that are most popular are the ones that are targeted at groups that are perceived to be especially deserving of support. One reason, I mean, the interesting thing that came up was in the case of the child tax credit, one of the objections to the 2021 expansion of the child tax credit was that it eliminated the work requirement. There was an implicit work requirement in the child tax credit that the benefit, the refundable portion of the credit, the benefit you could get even if you didn't have tax liability, phased in as your earnings increased. And making the child tax credit fully refundable got rid of that. Another group that people tend to perceive as deserving is children who are innocents. They're, regardless of what their parents do, I think society feels no obligation to try to help them. So I was a little bit surprised that the kind of Puritan ethic behind work requirements would be dominant in the discussion about child tax credit. And just one more point to add to your two criteria, I would kind of question the premise, which is you're saying that, well, there's no evidence that these work requirements actually increase work. And my response is I think a lot of people just ignore the evidence. They say, well, if you put in a work requirement, by definition, that requires work. So it must make people work, as opposed to just disqualifying people who don't or can't meet their work requirements.
Huh. So actually, I was going to go to a group question, and I want to go to that question, but I want to follow up on that last point. So take us inside for the folks who have testified in government, who have worked in government. How can that happen in a room, right? So someone talks about adding work requirements. There are staffers there, and people are like, "Listen, it's logical, of course," but don't the staffers say, hey, we've got a pile of social science research that says this doesn't work? I mean, why doesn't the wisdom rule in a group setting where people are talking about this and people are, in a sense, just kind of relying on this folk theory?
Well, you're just considering facts and you're not thinking about the alternative facts.
Okay.
So
Remember that from the first term. But
Yeah.
Yeah, I think actually, I mean, and I don't really think this is a partisan issue. I think advocates for particular programs support, some of them at least support them because they think it should work, whether or not it does. I had an argument with a friend a long time ago who was working in social safety net programs, and I said that I thought there were probably some programs that didn't provide benefits large enough to be worth their cost. And she just refused that just couldn't be true because they were all designed to help people who really needed help. And whether or not they actually did, or whether they did it at a reasonable cost, was not something to consider. And it's certainly true that, Paul Ryan, who was the Republican leader in the House, was a big advocate for setting up the the Evidence Commission, which the Evidence Act, which put forward a bunch of initiatives, including one that I was participant in, that was aimed at getting more evidence to support policymaking. But I think there are a lot of policymakers who would just as lieve be able to use their talking points without being troubled by what research evidence has to show. And that is troubling, but I believe it's true. Maybe Colleen has a different view on that.
I mean,
Colleen?
yeah, Chris, I mean, my sense is that it is a combination of the two explanations you gave, that we needed to find some extra change to pay for the tax cuts. And we found that cutting the costs of SNAP and Medicaid explicitly. And part of that came from these work requirements. And it doesn't feel as bad to talk about cutting. We're not cutting the program. We're just asking people to do the right thing. And so the fact that thinking about what that means and the administrative costs of monitoring that, I think took a sideline to, we need to find the savings to cover the other things that we want to pay for. I think it was known, and it was because we were looking for the savings, and these were not acts to improve SNAP. We fundamentally changed the cost burden. We weren't trying to redesign the program in ways that would make it work more effectively, or improve other outcomes for SNAP recipients. The goal of this was really about finding ways to decrease discretionary spending.
If I could add as well, Chris, I completely agree with everything, and I know Len and Colleen know much more about the specific pieces than I do. But from a broader procedural piece and working with Congress in a number of ways in the past, I think part of the challenge with this approach too was it took so many shortcuts that committees of jurisdiction didn't have a chance to talk about these things and do it in a transparent way that would allow for the debate and what you described as, kind of a duh moment to say, wait, what are we doing? How does this work? And I think that's part of it. If you're someone like Milton Friedman and you're looking at incentives, this whole weird, warped omnibus approach, or even worse than an omnibus, there was a lot of re-election incentives that were part of this, but it resulted in fiscal inefficiency and taxpayer losses. And I think that's a part of it as well. I don't know if Len or Colleen have anything else to add to that element of it, but I think that's a consequence of what we talked about as well.
I think that's such a good point. I don't think the ag committees would have approved of these SNAP. Sure. And at various points, they ruled them out. And it was only because it was an omnibus bill that it got through. If this had just been at the Farm Bill, these measures would not have been included in the Farm Bill, I think.
Yep. And that's a strategy. I mean, that was a political strategy all along, I think, was to make it the one big, beautiful bill so that it could have all of these things that didn't go through the formal process steps that it should to give the American people what they really deserve.
And I don't think there were no hearings before this bill. It was committees and friends of people on the committees who had their own analyses. I think there were some think tanks that had a lot of influence on provisions that went into the bill, but there was no debate. If you compare that with, say, the Tax Reform Act of 1986, when there was a year of hearings on various aspects of the bill, and it helped to shape it into something completely different. From the point of view of the president and the leaders in Congress who really wanted to get this bill enacted quickly, I think it was probably a politically very effective strategy. I mean, it was remarkable that they got this giant, giant bill enacted by July 4th of the year the president took office. But it wasn't best for bringing evidence to bear on the proceedings. I should also clarify one thing. In the case of the child tax credit, there is some evidence that the child tax credit and the incentives in it affect employment. There's actually Syracuse, a recent Syracuse graduate, who I'm working with, who has found that the child tax credit design can have effects on unemployment. They're relatively small. And when parents decide not to work despite the possibility of a child tax credit that's tied to employment, the reason is most likely because they have a young child and they're a single parent and they need to spend their time with their children, with or without the credit. But in the case of these other provisions, the evidence isn't there at all. And also there are other options, which we looked at, that could massively benefit lower income households with children and would have virtually no effect on employment. And those also haven't been considered yet.
Okay, thank you. So I had a general question, but there's so much enthusiasm from the audience in the Q&A that I think I'm going to pivot to audience questions, and then maybe I'll find some time near the end to ask my general question. If I don't ask it then I'm going to take the three of you out for a nice dinner and ask you over a bottle of wine. But before that, let's get to some of the audience questions. So the first question, I'm going to combine two. This is from Fran Vogel and Tom Barrington. So the questions are about if and when a new administration comes in, is it possible to change or do away with any of the provisions of the OBBB? And as a subset of that from Tom, what parts will be the most difficult to undo in the future? So feel free to take this from your own policy area or just broadly. Brent, you want to go?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, maybe I'll say something. It will be mildly correct, and then Len, please police up whatever I say that isn't. But I think that, this question of if and when a new administration comes in, how do you change it? Technically, yes, you can change it, but the mechanism matters. Also, some provisions can be reversed through budget reconciliation with spending and revenue changes, but others will be, you have this, everything's embedded in agency rulemaking and administrative guidance, which take a lot longer to unwind. And the hardest pieces to change are downstream. Once you put something like this into place, it's much easier to put a law, like putting a law in place is relatively easy comparatively, because it's a bunch of people. It's 400 and some people in one chamber and 100 in another, and their staffs working through this. And I'm oversimplifying it grossly, but that's the relatively easy part. When you have millions of people on the implementation side that are trying to make this happen, that's what is much harder to undo, and the consequences of undoing that are a hidden cost when you do these kinds of things. So that is just, I don't know what the magnitude of that will be, if there's been studies but it'll be agencies can't unilaterally ignore what has just come out in the hope that it's undone in the future. They have to do these things, and the costs are incredible, and the effort to undo them is going to be significant.
So I just want to say that Congress can create a new bill anytime. We don't even need a new president. So Congress could undo some of this legislatively.
Once they're back in session. Yeah.
Once they have to actually be in session. Yeah, absolutely. So it's possible Trump could veto, who knows, right? But I just want to be clear, we don't have to wait for a new presidential administration, because this is actually a legislative activity that we need. We need a Congress who's willing to change their mind. There's a lot of provisions of the Medicaid provisions that come in slowly over time. Some of those are designed not to come in until after the midterm elections, for example. And so some of this is easier to undo if it hasn't been fully implemented. I think in my mind, some of this cost sharing shift from the federal government to the state government could be something that states are really going to feel the pain for that. We're all going to feel the pain of that, from either higher state taxes or a huge reduction in other services, including in SNAP and Medicaid. But in my mind, I think we're really going to see, like, the composition of state budgets is going to shift dramatically, and that is going to create its own pressure. I don't know whether that will naturally create another incentive for change. I think that's why people like Josh Hawley is really being an advocate for SNAP and for Medicaid right now, because he knows Missouri just doesn't have the money to cover these extra costs in his home state. But yeah, I'll listen there.
Just say that tax bills are routinely modified, and particularly the ones that are passed as part of this reconciliation process they're subject to rules that prevent them from raising the deficit outside the 10-year budget window. So a number of the major provisions of this bill are temporary, and they'll expire sometime over the next 10 years. And at least at that point, Congress will have to make an explicit decision about whether to let those provisions expire, or whether to change them or to modify them. And this bill, it modified provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that were enacted in 2017. So it didn't just extend them as is. So there will be opportunities, kind of action forcing events. For example, the state and local tax deduction increase is only in place for, I think, like 4 or 5 years. And at that point, I think 2029, Congress will presumably consider, this will be in the next president's administration or in President Trump's third term, and that Congress will have to take some legislative action to keep that from going back to its original level. The other thing is that people decide they care about the debt and deficits, that a logical place to gain some revenue would be in modifying some of the provisions of this bill.
Okay, thanks. So Len, I'm going to stick with you. The next question is from Kyle Mitchell. And Kyle asks, how can policymakers strike a balance between encouraging private investment and ensuring that the tax code doesn't exacerbate wealth inequality?
That's a really good question. And it's kind of a perpetual issue in design of tax policy, is the trade-off between economic efficiency, broadly kind of promoting economic growth, and equity, which is, keeping the income distribution from becoming less unequal, also treating people in similar positions similarly, which I should mention, OB3A was terrible at that. It provided a lot of special breaks for particular groups. That traditional wisdom on how to modify the tax code to promote growth and equity is to broaden the base, to get rid of a lot of the special provisions that benefit one group or another. It makes things simpler because people aren't subject to different rules depending on their circumstances. It allows revenue to be raised without raising marginal tax rates, which are thought to discourage productivity and investment. And that was the motivation behind the Tax Reform Act of 1986. They lowered marginal tax rates a lot. The top tax bracket fell from 50% to 28%, but it raised the same amount of revenue as the law had before because they got rid of so many loopholes. Beyond that, there are a lot of things that are good for economic growth that aren't on the tax side. I mean, one thing that would be helpful would be to restore and expand the H-1B visa program, which President Trump has proposed to modify and turn into something that rich companies could pay for a living. We get a lot of innovation from smart foreigners who come in the country. Some of them study at Syracuse University. A lot of them want to stay, and when they do stay, they're they help to promote innovation in the country. The government invests a lot in R&D. It actually does a lot through the Defense Department. Investing in research and development makes American companies more productive, and I think it's a major advantage here. Investing, there are things state and local governments can do with federal help, like investing more in education. So we have a workforce that's better able to adapt to, say, the changes of more use of AI and things like that, adapt to new technologies and be productive. So thinking that it's all on the tech side, I think is really misleading. We have, one of the things I've always thought we're lucky about is that you can have a pretty crummy tax system and still have a country that's pretty rich and dynamic, which the United States has been for most of our lifetimes. So it's not all tax. And to the extent that tax revenues raise money that you can use to make other productive investments, like in roads and infrastructure and things like that, even if there's somewhat higher marginal tax rates that might discourage some investment, it still can be a net a boost for productivity. And as I said before, investing in children over the long run pays huge returns. There was a study by Nate Hendren and colleagues where he looked at all sorts of different investments and saw how their payoffs compared with what they cost in terms of lost government revenues. And they found almost across the board that the most productive investments were investments in children.
I'll put a plug in, if I could, Len, to I think some targeted incentives and I'll talk about my last life in talent management. If you invest in public things with public returns, like workforce training and, like you said, R&D or whatnot, that invariably helps with it. And then also you support asset formation at the bottom with match savings and baby bonds and portable benefits and things like that. But I think it should be something that tax policy should reward productive capital formation, not just preservation. And I think most of this was preservation, if I'm not mistaken.
So let me ask a follow-up on the Trump account / baby bonds, and then there are some questions in the chat box Q&A that I'm going to ask Colleen. So the Trump accounts first came on the radar when they were pitched by Cory Booker and Senator Harris, right, as baby bonds, right? And the way that they were framed was as a way to address the racial wealth gap, right, in the country. So is there a potential to change the structure of the Trump accounts where they do, in a sense, broaden opportunities for Americans who currently might be paycheck to paycheck to build wealth?
So when I was at Treasury, we worked on a program that was called Universal Savings Accounts. And it was a highly progressive program designed to basically put money into individual 401k accounts, things like that, a thing like that. And for low-income people, basically all the money would come from the federal government. They could add money themselves, but they're poor, so they don't have it to put in. And for higher income people, they could make contributions that wouldn't be subsidized as much. The problem I have with baby bonds, and maybe Colleen would have a more informed perspective on this, is that you put $1,000 in an account for somebody living in abject poverty and required to be kept there until they're 18 years old, and maybe with interest it grows into $5,000 or $6,000. First of all, it's not a lot of money relative to the needs that you have at that age. But secondly, it's kind of like saying, well, we're going to give you your own little nest egg. And if you can't use that to solve your problems, well, at least we tried. It seems like more of a symbolic effort. Colleen, have you thought about and actually Chris, Brent, and you probably thought about this more than I have.
Yeah, I'm actually, I mean, the baby bond idea is that maybe everybody starts out with $1,000, but then it is progressive in regards to income. So if you're over a certain level, maybe you don't get anything, but if you're below the poverty level, maybe you get $500 a year, and that there continues to be deposits made on behalf of the child. And so this is a start towards that. It is one of my favorite things. I see there's a question in the chat about, like, can you name one positive thing? I see the Trump accounts as the beginning of something that could grow into something that is actually very helpful. So I think there's a lot of focus on that wealth accumulation. I think this could be something that allows, particularly if we can figure out how to get more money into these accounts, if they're invested in the stock market and they can grow over time, I think it could give people a sense of new possibilities when they reach 18. Typically, these types of accounts can be used for going to college or some sort of additional skill accumulation, starting a business, or buying a house. And so those types of activities are wealth accumulating, and it strikes me that these things, like it, I saw the bones of a good policy idea that could be fleshed out into something that I could be very excited about.
Have any countries done something like this? I'm wondering if there's any evidence to inform this.
So I don't know. I don't know about countries, because most folks would just give people on an annual basis and not have these extra like administrative costs, with putting it aside and all of that. But the simulations I've seen suggest that it could reduce racial inequality by 50% if the full baby bond piece, which again has that, the poorer you are, more is put into the account on your behalf. So I like those simulation results. I don't think that's probably how it will be implemented ever in the US, but it gives me some reason to think that this could be a good idea. But Len, I hear your skepticism, and I can't. It's just when people ask me what my favorite thing is, that's what I was going to say.
I just think, the kids who grow up in dire poverty go to substandard schools, and particularly in urban areas, and then they reach 18. I think their chance of being able to hold on to the money beyond that is a lot lower than what it is for people with higher incomes, because they're going to have desperate needs at that point, and that might be good, but it's what they spend the money on will be different from what privileged children would, even if they got a smaller subsidy.
So let me talk about a potential political psychological good of the Trump accounts, if we're looking for something positive. There is a period post World War II where regular household income was growing at a faster rate than the top of the income distribution. The idea was a rising tide lifted all boats, right? When people sat down and watched the nightly news and heard about economic indicators, they saw when the economy was good, that reflected in their own life. So in political science, there's a kind of a finding that one of the main predictions for presidential elections from 1945 through the late 90s was people's projection about how the economy was doing. It dwarfed any other variable in predicting whether the incumbent was going to win or lose. Since the late 90s, people's economic evaluations are purely partisan. My party's in the White House, the economy's great. My party's out of the White House, the economy's right. It's completely divorced from reality. So policy mechanisms that could change the psychology of regular Americans, where they feel that they have a stake in what in the last 20 years feels like an elite game, could help in feeling that they, have some type of like fiduciary benefit or some type of, skin in the game for when the economy goes well, when they hear about GDP numbers, when they hear about the market, it's not something that other people are benefiting from that maybe they could benefit from, and that could change their policy calculus.
So you got poor people who want the president to focus on the stock market too.
Yeah. So Colleen identified that question. Can we hear from, so Colleen gave hers. Brent, can we hear yours? Like what, and particularly when it comes to like defense spending, is there is there anything there that you see as really solving a much needed problem? Like what do all the changes in defense spending say about either our military readiness or change in military policy? Or anything particularly good that you saw there that you're like, that is really solving a much needed problem?
Yeah, I mean, there was this $150 billion defense boost, but what happened was you blended it. Like someone like George Marshall, if he was looking at this, he would be cringing right now. I don't think he would have let this happen because he was, for those of you that aren't familiar, George Marshall was considered the architect of victory in World War II, and he became the U.S. Army Chief of Staff in 1939, and he became the namesake for the Marshall Plan as the Secretary of State 10 years later, and so on. So someone like him would see this where you're blending domestic security with traditional defense spending into this something that I think starts to become a direct assault on one of the most fragile lines in any democracy, which is the one separating military capability from domestic politics. And I think once blurred, that's really hard to redraw. And I think in this case, while you have increased spending in some areas, the general tone is that there's just not much, the resources didn't align to that which is needed for real security. And I think time will tell, but in when you're spending a lot of these things in walls and technology and roads and for $46 billion and $14 billion in state support and expanded detention and deportation items for Homeland Security in the same conversations you're having for increasing acquisition of lower cost, high volume drones as opposed to manned aircraft or whatever it is, it blurs these responsibilities, and it's hard to parse out what's good and what's not in there from a traditional sense. And I think it'll take some time to sort that out.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask a quick follow-up specifically about the ICE spending? You have that at the time that people have identified kind of across partisan and ideology, border security being a real issue. But videos of these ICE forces in cities that have gone viral, can you talk a little bit about how we should put into context the drastic increase in ICE funding?
I'll say that, well, I think a lot of it's political theater that you're seeing, but on the one hand, but the real effect is, people don't interact with Congress. They interact with agencies. They interact with county offices. They interact with service desks. They interact with potentially the ICE agent, or they may see that going on in their streets. They have colleagues. They go to a restaurant. They see somebody in the service sector or the hospitality sector or whatnot affected by this. And that's where you start to judge democracy in our democratic processes. And in this case, I just see these downstream and implementation effects. I know I keep coming back to that, but I see all of this results in an eroding of Congress in our political institutions. And I don't know, it's going to take a lot to recover from that over time. And with 3 more years of this, and depending on, we saw some elections the other night, and we see these midterms coming up in a year, and that will give some indication, but it's still going to be a battle. to get through the next 3 years from the point of view of how does all of this increase to trust in our system?
Yeah, thank you. So there's some questions in the Q&A about the social safety net. Colleen, can you talk about like how many people are impacted by the social safety net outside of the major healthcare programs, and how the OBBB might influence those folks?
Well, I can tell you there are 42 million individuals on SNAP currently, and about 70 million on Medicaid. Those are the programs I know best about the provisions. There are many other safety net programs. They're all vastly smaller. So like the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit that Len talks about, had about 23 million recipients last year, which is, you know, half the size of SNAP. And so SNAP and Medicaid are big programs, and they also have a lot of money that goes to them. So many people that receive those programs, they may participate in both, and they may participate in lots of other programs too, low-income heating assistance or Meals on Wheels, which gets some federal dollars. So I don't have a way to talk about like the reach of the full safety net. There's a lot of components to it at the federal, state, and local level.
Okay. Let me follow up with a question that relates to a lot of the students who are here on this panel. Brent mentioned the election results. Mamdani won the New York City mayor's race, running on a platform of affordability. When I talk with my students after class about politics, the things that concern them are about affording college, having to postpone major life choices like getting married and having children because of how inaffordable those are. Can you talk about first how federal policy biases older, so there's the income inequality, but there's also generational inequality, right, that is supported by our federal policy system, and how this particular act either made that worse or better? Len?
So the biggest thing the tax code does to affect older people is Social Security, right? Which is a combination of a tax and a benefit program, and it's Social Security has done a pretty good job of vastly reducing elderly poverty, which was at very high rates before it was enacted. But it still provides significant benefits to upper middle income people. The additional standard deduction for seniors, as I mentioned, is only for people 65 and over, and it helps upper middle income people. The standard deduction is capped, so it doesn't benefit very high income people. I'm trying to think about other things in the tax code specifically that would benefit older people. I'm coming up short right now. I think a lot of the programs that benefit older people are primarily through, well, we exempt a significant portion of Social Security benefits from taxation. Even before President Trump's promise, most old people didn't have to pay income tax, because if they were relying entirely or almost entirely on Social Security benefits, and not enough of those were included in taxable income that they actually were subject to the income tax. But there are a lot of direct spending, like Medicare, obviously almost entirely benefits older people. A significant portion of Medicaid goes to benefit older people because it covers a large share of long-term care expenses. I think Colleen knows more about that than I do. And those are very expensive programs, and they're on autopilot because they're not annually appropriated. They're mandatory programs.
Colleen, do you have any thoughts about the generational gap as far as when it comes to social assistance?
I mean, so there are more programs that focus on children in this country than older adults. We have the big one, Social Security, and we have, you know, basically nationalized healthcare for older adults. So, but we have lots of little programs for children. And so, our households with children. And so to some extent, I think if you look at the difference example between the official poverty measure and the supplemental poverty measure, which takes into account the value of all these other social assistance programs, you actually see that there's a lot more people, a lot fewer children rather, that are poor under the supplemental measure, and a lot more older adults who are poor under the supplemental measure. And so our social safety net, with the exception of Social Security, which kind of seems like an odd thing to say because it's a really big exception, tends to, I think, favor children under the age of 18. Certainly by the time you're seeing them in the classroom, we don't do a lot to support the transition to adulthood. And so this is a place where I think trying to make sure people get a foot in the labor market, whatever that looks like for them. And again, that's something Brent could talk about, I'm sure. I think if we could make that transition smoother for more people, that the country would be better off as a whole. And there are other countries that do a better job with that for sure.
Yeah, like Brent, if a 19-year-old Syracuse student came up to you and said, you know, listen, I don't want to vote because I don't feel that there's any federal policy that is trying to help me. I don't think politicians are trying to speak to me or my generation. Is there anything that you could point them to that is trying to help them build a career, build a family, build a life?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely programs there that are helpful. There is good things that exist in our federal system. I think this particular bill, I haven't pulled those specific things out yet. Like, I don't think there was anything specifically to target that. I'll go back to the defense conversation for just a minute. You know, my son is a lieutenant up at Fort Drum, and just got back from a year in Syria. And he, you know, this bill will do some things in the immediate term, like it will, they will see some quality of life improvements, and housing will get better, and there will be parts for their equipment, and some of that will trickle in. But in some ways, it's, you know, he's going to inherit a lot of fiscal debt, and there is going to be a lot of strategic ambiguity. And the civic friction that the omnibus bills leave behind is problematic. So it's good in some ways and not it's a long-term negative without some correction over time. And hopefully that correction's there. If I was going to talk then to a student that came into my office, I would say that you know, look at both the short and long term of this. I think that you should still have this civic aspiration because you should be in the ring if you want to fix something. And this is a perfect example. Then these elections that just happened recently, you know, several days ago, combined with this bill that was put into place 6 months ago-ish, you see the balance here. And this legislative process signals certain things, and then there's elections have consequences for this. And you see the groups that voted for in the election in New York, in some ways, it was the younger population that was still indicating a severe dissatisfaction with what came out as the proponents of the big, beautiful bill. And I think there's something to that is worth us continuing to examine. I would hope, and I strongly think that if I had to do it all over again and I was that 18-year-old and I was or the grad student in an MPA program, I would absolutely pick a career in public service, because you can't change the system from yelling at it from the stands. You've got to get in the ring.
All right, thank you. Len or Colleen, any last thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with?
I did want to say one more thing that relates to intergenerational inequality, and that is that the massive increase in debt over the last 40 years has disproportionately benefited old people. Basically, we're not paying for government, and that mostly benefits particularly better off people who well, this is a normative statement, who probably should be paying a significant portion of the cost of government. And I think that's a concern, particularly if you don't think that we can accumulate debt forever, which most economists think.
So Chris, I would say that there's a lot of policy details that are going to be in motion for quite some time with SNAP and Medicaid, and how these play out at the state level is going to vary dramatically. So on the one hand, this is going to be a natural experiment. We're going to see what happens with different interpretations and different levels of generosity. Unfortunately, the USDA announced we're no longer going to be measuring food insecurity at the national level with the current population survey food security supplement. So we are not going to know necessarily how the impact of some of these SNAP provisions and how they vary at the state level in terms of food insecurity, which has been one of the primary yardsticks that we've been looking at our food and nutrition assistance programs. But we'll continue to look for other measures of well-being, and surely we'll be looking at the health of our population and looking at more variation, most likely. So where you live matters, and people can definitely have more say, perhaps at the state level, and how these things play out in their own communities.
Yeah. Well, we'll continue to monitor how these play out in our communities and in our nation. And I want to thank all the audience members who came into our ring today to help us discuss. Sorry for some of the folks who I could not get to your questions. There was so many questions today. Great sign. And I'm sure the audience will join me online, of course, in thanking our three panelists for their expertise, insights, and area addition today. Colleen Heflin, Len Burman, and Brent Parmenter, thank you so much for joining us. And we hope to see you in the future in and around the Maxwell School. Thank you, everyone.